How do you develop microservices? Now that's a very broad question and you might answer by writing code. So let me be more precise. How do you manage dependencies of the service that you're developing? There could be one or two or five or tens or hundreds of services that you need to communicate with while developing a single one of them. Here's the problem. When working with microservices, we have many of them, and you might not be able to run them all locally. You might not be able to run locally even those that you have direct dependencies with, so you're likely going to run them in a remote Kubernetes cluster, maybe in a staging environment, or maybe even in production. While developing a single microservice, you might need to connect that service with others running somewhere else. Some of them might be in a local Kubernetes cluster, but some might be somewhere else. And we need to figure out how to connect what you're developing with these dependencies running somewhere else, or maybe even spread across multiple clusters and environments. What we need to do in those situations is connect the application or the microservice that we are developing with those running somewhere else. And it can get even more complicated because we can have dependencies in such a way that the remote service might need to come back to us. So it's not only us connecting to services running somewhere else, but services running elsewhere connecting back to us. So the directions can be inbound or outbound or both, depending on what we really need and what we are working on. Today we are going to explore a solution that might help with that problem, and that solution is called CodeZero, and it contains of two different components, teleport and intercept. We're going to see them both and afterwards comment and discuss whether such a project is worthwhile using or not. The only thing I did before I started recording this session was to create a Kubernetes cluster. That's a cluster where I will deploy the dependencies later on. For now, the only thing I have is a Kubernetes cluster. The first thing I will do is install CodeZero CLI, and I will do that by executing npm install. And this is the first thing I do not like. From the very get-go, the thing I do not like about CodeZero is that the installation goes through npm. There is nothing wrong with npm, there is nothing wrong with JavaScript. The issue is that I believe that installation of CLIs should be simpler than that. I'm using Mac, so I would expect brew install, or I might be using Chocolate in Windows and so on and so forth. It all really depends on what your operating system is, and I do not even need the package management. I would be fine with a single binary that I download and put in USR bin or wherever you're putting binaries. I do not think that it makes sense to have such dependencies as, hey, you need npm to install this, and then you need Python to install that, and maybe you will need Go for the third CLI to compile it and install it, and so on and so forth. CLIs should be compiled to binaries and not npm or Python or whatever the language is in which the CLI was written. On the other hand, it's not such a big deal. Almost everybody has npm already in their operating system, and I'm probably finding issues where there are no really issues. However, if you're watching this channel, you know how I operate. I like to tell you about things I like, but also things I don't like. Okay, now that I installed the CLI, I need to initialize it, and I need to do that as sudo because it will write some things to the host file, and to do that, it needs privileged access to the host file, so it needs to be sudo. It's not ideal, but it's understandable. Next, I will deploy a silly application, call it a microservice, to a cluster that I'm running, and we will use that microservice to explore how we can connect what I'm developing locally with that service. Later on, we are going to come up with slightly more complicated example, but for now, all I want to see is how to connect the application I'm working on to the application running somewhere else. And you will see soon why that might be a problem, why that might be an issue. And for you to understand why that might be more complicated than it might seem, I'm going to list all the resources that I deployed, and you will see that there is something missing, intentionally missing over there. I have a deployment which created a replica set, which created pods. I have horizontal pod autoscaler, and I have a service. Now, service in question is the key to the problem or understanding the issue. It is set to be cluster IP, and that means that that service is accessible only through other services running in the same cluster. And that's normal for backend applications. If this would be front-end or some application that is accessible from outside of the cluster, I would create ingress and then it would be accessible from outside, and then I would not have a problem that I'm having right now. But this application, microservice, is an internal one. It is supposed to be accessible only from within the cluster, and that's a common pattern. Why would I expose that service to the outside world if there is no reason to do that? However, the issue is that I cannot access that application. It is not exposed to the world outside that cluster, and I do need to connect to it because it could be a dependency of the application I'm developing. And this is where CodeZero comes to the rescue. I will teleport into that application. I will enable that application to be accessible to me and only to me. So I will not make it accessible globally. Nobody else will be able to reach that application except me. And the command is czcutl deployment teleport, and the name of the application I want to connect to is called silly demo, and it is in the staging namespace. And we can see from the output that it started a tunnel into staging. I mean, that's not really correct. It started a tunnel into the application running in the staging namespace. So let me try it out. And before I do, remember, I did not expose this application outside that cluster. The type of the associated service is local IP, and there is no ingress, so it is not accessible to outside world, or at least it wasn't before I teleported into it. So let's see whether it works. I will skip the whole deal of showing you how I would do it from the application. I will just execute a simple curl command into silly demo on port 8080. And there we go, I got the response. It says this is a silly demo version 100. Remember the version, it will become important later. I can also be more specific and say, hey, send a request to silly demo in the namespace staging on the port 8080. And the result is the same because I sent a request to the same service. I just used a different host of that service because CodeZero created quite a few hosts. Actually, let me show you all the hosts by listing the contents of the host file. And we can see that there is silly demo.staging, silly demo.staging.svc, and so on and so forth. There are all the variations of the host through which we can access that service, and you're probably going to use just the name of the service or the name of the service in the namespace. Now let's see what happens if I have the same service running in multiple namespaces. Would I be able to choose which one I want to connect to? Will I be able to connect to both of them? I'm not sure whether there is a use case for something like that, but let me check it out nevertheless. So I will deploy the same application to the default namespace. The one that is already running is in staging, so I will create a copy of that application in the default namespace, and let's see what will happen. All I have to do is execute czcutl. I mean, it's hard to pronounce, right? czcutl. I don't like the name. I don't like things that are complicated to pronounce. czcutl. Maybe it will grow on me. We'll see. Anyways, I will execute czcutl deployment teleport silly demo. That's the same as before, but this time I'm going to specify the namespace default. And it cannot do it. It's complaining that, hey, you already have the same service, the service with the same name running in a different namespace in staging, and I cannot do the same thing for the default namespace. And that's a bit silly because, as you saw before, it allows us to specify the namespace in the host of the application we're trying to access. So I see no good reason why I shouldn't be able to teleport into both of them and choose which I'm going to use. On the other hand, the chances that you will try to teleport into the same service running in different namespaces, like staging and production, for example, are very low. You're probably going to use one or the other. So this is me again finding issues where there are no issues. But hey, I like to try different things. Now let's imagine a slightly more complicated scenario. Let's say that I have a service in a cluster running somewhere that should communicate with the service that I'm developing with the application on my laptop. In production, it would be something like, hey, there is application A that communicates with application B running in the same cluster, But if I'm developing application B, then I need the first one, the application A, running in a remote cluster to talk to the one running on my laptop, which is more complicated scenario than the previous one because I could still overcome the issues with the first one, the first scenario, by exposing that application through a node port or something like that. But this is something different. I do not want to communicate with the service from my laptop. I want the one running remotely somewhere else to talk to me. So let me run the dependent service, the service B on my laptop first. It will be the same application that is currently running in a cluster, and that's the application that I want to run now locally. I'm simulating that I'm developing it. And to do that, I will pass a couple of variables. I will set the version to 101, and I will set the port to 8081, and then execute go run, which will run my application locally. Don't worry, I'm not teaching you Go today. This is just a demo, right? You could apply the same thing to any language. The important thing is that version 100 is running in a remote cluster and version 101 is running locally. We will use the version to distinguish one from the other. Now let's see what happens if I create another application, application A, in that same cluster that should communicate with application B that is running both inside that cluster but also locally. I could not make myself write 20 lines of Go code or something like that, so I will simulate that application by executing curl from a pod inside of that cluster, and the output says this is a silly demo version 100, and that outcome was to be expected. There is something running in a remote cluster that tries to communicate with something else running in that same remote cluster, and it got a response, and that's version 100 running in that remote cluster. But that is not what I want. I want the application in that cluster to communicate with the application running locally. Imagine that I'm developing a backend and I want frontend running in a cluster to speak with the backend running in my laptop. What matters is for you to remember that version 100 is running in a cluster and version 101 is running locally on my computer. Now to solve this problem, this issue, I will execute czctl service intercept, and the namespace is staging, and the application that should be intercepted is silly demo, and it is running right now on my computer on a local port 8081 and should be accessible from remote applications on port 8080, and there is a header saying silly demo. This header is important and I will explain why later. Without the header, the results would be horrible, and let me explain why. If I want to redirect all the requests going to that application to my local computer, then I would affect everybody and everything that is communicating with that application, because there might be other apps in that cluster that speak with it, and there might be other people sending requests to that application. There might be many entities that are using that application right now, and I do not want to redirect all of them to my local copy of the application, the one I'm developing. I want to intercept and forward requests only when I'm sending them, and I can distinguish my requests from all other requests by adding a header and telling CodeZero that it should intercept only the requests that have a specific header. Now let's see if I start a container in that cluster that will send the same request as before, what will happen. Remember, my mission is not to affect anybody but me. So the first thing I want to see is what happens when a normal request is sent to that application. And nothing special happened. I'm still getting a response from the remote application running in a cluster. And I know that through the version. It says 100. And now comes the real test. What will happen if I send the same request but add the header silly demo, or whatever the header is, whatever was specified in the intercept command. And this time the response says, this is a silly demo version 101. So an entity, a process running in my cluster, sent a request to the application running in the same cluster, but CodeZero intercepted that request and forwarded it to the application running on my laptop. And that is absolutely awesome. That gives me all the communication paths that I might need. When I need something on my laptop to communicate with an application running in a cluster that is not exposed to the outside world, I can just execute czcutl teleport. And when I want to intercept requests that other applications are making to that application and forward them to the copy running on my computer, I can just execute czcutl intercept, which will intercept those requests, and if there is a specific header, forward them to me, while everybody else would be oblivious that anything is intercepting anything. For everybody else, the world continues working as if nothing happened. All that magic is happening by a combination of the CLI on my laptop and a pod that was created in that specific namespace. You can see Interceptor silly demo running over there, which is great because that pod is intercepting the requests and forwarding them wherever they should go or not, depending on whether there is or there isn't a specific header. And the only potential issue I see with that is if I would like to intercept applications, microservices running in production, I would probably not be allowed. It probably wouldn't be wise to run random pods in production, but this is a tool that is specifically aimed at developing, and we are usually not developing or working with dependencies running in production, but rather in staging or pre-production or a production-like environment. In any case, I could not even imagine a solution to the problem without something running in a cluster. In other words, there must be an entity that is taking care of intercepting requests and forwarding them to wherever you are working on. Once we are finished working, once we do not need those dependencies or communication with those dependencies, we can just execute czcutl session close and either specify which session we want to close or set --all to close all the sessions, and then everything goes back to where it was before we started. There is actually one more thing that I want to check before we talk about CodeZero, and that's the host file. I closed all the sessions, and I hope that CodeZero did not leave garbage in that file. I really hate garbage. I hate when somebody pollutes my file system without cleaning up afterwards. And yeah, it cleaned up everything. There is no garbage. Big plus. I mean, tiny plus, right? But I like clean systems. And that's more or less it. That's all it does. And that's good. I like small tools that are very specific, fulfill certain objectives, and help me with certain tasks without becoming monsters that do too many things and are hard to learn, and I don't like them because not all the things are great. CodeZero mission, at least at this moment, is very simple, and that's what makes it great. It allows us to send requests or communicate with applications running somewhere else without those applications being exposed to the world outside the clusters where they are running, and it allows us to intercept requests made from applications running in the same cluster and forward those requests to the application running locally. And it does that only if there is a specific header involved in those requests, so that nobody else is affected by those actions or those tasks. If we exclude the installation done through npm, there is nothing bad to say about it. I think it's absolutely awesome. So let's talk about pros and cons. And let's start with, what should I start with? Let's say cons. Docs are not really detailed. They do not explain well what's going on and how it's working and so on and so forth. So if you're into reading documentation as literature, then CodeZero might fail you. I do not like that installation is done through npm, and I do not like the fact that I cannot teleport into the same application or same service running in multiple namespaces. Or to be more precise, I can teleport into an application running in multiple namespaces, but I cannot do that as two separate actions. It's a weird situation. Nevertheless, with the exception of documentation, which I'm going to comment a bit more in a minute or two, none of those downsides are really important. That's only me nitpicking and finding faults in something that's actually working pretty well. And in that spirit, let's move to advantages or pros of CodeZero. And the first one is documentation. Now you might be confused. I said, hey, documentation is not great, and now I'm saying the documentation is great. And let me explain why I'm saying that. Documentation is not very detailed, and I kind of like it because sometimes I feel that documentation is insulting my intelligence by writing paragraphs and paragraphs and paragraphs of something that is kind of obvious. This is a small tool. You can figure it out without docs, just by executing CLI. And the docs are mostly based on, hey, this is the command, execute this is what will happen, you're a big boy, you will understand what it means. And I like it because it forced me to try it out instead of just reading documentation, because reading documentation will not give you the real picture of what's going on. You need to try it out, and documentation is guiding you well in how to try it. Another one is simplicity. It's simple, it's easy, it does what it's supposed to do, and it doesn't do anything else. And that's kind of brilliant. And the last one, and this is a big one, it does not use VPNs or anything of the sorts. And I really, really, really dislike VPNs or virtual private networks. They're always slow, buggy, they complicate things. CodeZero does not use VPNs, and that's kind of brilliant. And the only real competition I know to CodeZero, at least in its current state, would be telepresence. I'm not going to compare it with telepresence, at least not in this video. Let me know if that's something you're looking for, and if it is, I will do something like telepresence versus CodeZero and then go through pros and cons and let you know which one you should use. For now, all I can say is that CodeZero does what it's supposed to do. It is simple, it is easy, and you should try it out. Go ahead, try it out, I'll wait. Actually, I will not wait, but what I will do is tell you that I opened memberships to the channel, so if you want to show the support for the channel, then you might want to become a member, and that helps a lot keeping the lights on, and it helps keeping this channel going and me paying all the expenses, and there are a lot of expenses. Anyways, thanks for watching, see you in the next video, cheers.